Hello, my name is Paul Belford and I'm the Director of the Clwyd Archaeological Trust based in Wales in the United Kingdom. Today I would like to take you on a journey to explore a particular site and how it, and the landscape of which it is part, has changed through time. Our subject is Beacon Ring, a hill fort located on the border of Wales and England. The Clwyd Archaeological Trust have owned this hill fort since 2008 and we've been working hard to understand and conserve it. Although most of this talk will focus on the very local and particular landscape of Beacon Ring, the hill fort is situated in a much wider geographical and scholarly context, so I'll begin by introducing some of the bigger picture. Here is a very wide-scale view of Beacon Ring's place in the world. Wales, which is currently part of the United Kingdom, is shown here in dark blue. Of course, Beacon Ring is not unique. Wales contains hundreds of hill forts. Indeed, in Ireland and the United Kingdom alone, there are more than 4,000 of them. And of course, hill forts are found throughout Europe. They are mainly concentrated in the north and west of our continent, but also in the Iberian Peninsula, as well as further south and east. Some are prehistoric, others more recent. So what is a hill fort? Hill forts come in many shapes and sizes and were built over many centuries. They normally consist of some sort of enclosure, usually created by banks and ditches. They are mostly found on or near the tops of hills, but not always. In the UK and Ireland, hill forts are mainly associated with the time period that archaeologists call the Iron Age, that is, between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. Even though archaeologists have been excavating hill forts for over 100 years, there is still much that we don't know about them. This drawing shows what a hill fort may have looked like when it was built. The banks were made of earth or stone and may have had walls or palisades made of timber. Inside there may have been circular dwellings known as roundhouses, as well as storage buildings for grain and livestock. However, not all hill forts were occupied all of the time, and some were never occupied at all. The name hill fort itself is also misleading. Not all hill forts are on hills, nor are they all forts. Many early archaeologists were military men. The well-known figure of Sir Mortimer Wheeler being a classic example, and they tended to describe the results of their archaeological work through the prism of their military experience. Wheeler famously excavated the great Dorset hill fort at Maiden Castle. These excavations, which took place in 1938 and 39 under the looming shadow of the Second World War, found a series of burials which Wheeler interpreted as a war cemetery of native Britons massacred by the Roman army. More recent work suggests that these were not the victims of a massacre, but peaceful burials. Wheeler's vivid descriptions of the battle at Maiden Castle probably reflected his own experience as an artillery officer on the Western Front in the First World War, rather than the archaeological evidence. Excavations elsewhere suggest that hill forts may have had a variety of uses. Perhaps one of their most important functions was as a regional gathering space for trade, ceremony and festivals. So this is a journey through space and time. First, let's look at time. In the West, we think of time as a linear progression. The European convention is that year zero is nominally the birth of Jesus Christ. The time before that is considered to be prehistory, and the time afterwards is historical time, although this does vary depending on where you are. Archaeologists have divided time into different periods which relate less to calendar dates and more to the sorts of technologies and cultures that were around at the time. So, in Beacon Ring's part of the British Isles, the Bronze Age began around 2000 years BCE, that is 4,000 years ago, and was characterised by an open, pastoral agriculture. From about 1000 years BCE, so around 3000 years ago, climate change and increased population resulted in more intensive land use and in more defensive approaches to settlement. 19th century archaeologists noticed the widespread use of iron tools in this period, so it became known as the Iron Age. Iron Age tribes in southern Britain came in increasingly close contact with the expanding Roman Empire. After Julius Caesar's expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, formal diplomatic and trading links were established. In 43 CE, the Romans invaded, and large areas of Britain adopted Roman culture, technology, and lifestyles. The departure of the Romans in the early 400s was followed by encounters with groups from other parts of northwest Europe and Scandinavia. This period saw the rise and fall of a series of small kingdoms in what later became England and Wales, engaged in various power struggles and alliances. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 saw another shift in power relations in that country, and centuries of creeping colonialism ensued. England absorbed Wales in the 13th century and then made advances on Scotland and Ireland. Significant consolidation of power took place under the Tudors and Stuarts. The modern period is usually divided by archaeologists into post-medieval, which historians call early modern, up to about 1700, and industrial and contemporary after that. The breaks between these more recent periods have traditionally been defined by historical events. The arrival of the Romans in the early 1st century and their departure in the early 5th century. The Battle of Hastings is symbolic of that 11th century transition in English politics, and arguably the break between medieval and modern is symbolised by the reign of Henry VIII and the creation of the Church of England and the dissolution of medieval monastic power. But archaeologists today tend to think much more in terms of long-term patterns and ordinary people rather than great battles or great leaders. And of course, the most important thing is that all of these periods, cultures and lifestyles overlap. Iron Age culture didn't suddenly stop when the Romans came, any more than Roman lifestyles were suddenly abandoned in 410. Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church was a significant milestone, but it was part of a longer journey from medieval to modern. These overlaps are very important for our own journey through space and time at Beacon Ring. Yes, Beacon Ring was built in the Iron Age, but it also exists today, and it has been the focus of activities in the landscape for over 2,000 years. So let's now look at that wider landscape, the space part of our journey today. Now, archaeologists are also very fond of maps. This map shows the modern landscape surrounding Beacon Ring, which is the red dot near the middle. The shaded areas show higher ground, rivers are in blue. Roads are yellow, railways brown. I said at the beginning that Beacon Ring is a hill fort located on the border of Wales and England, and that border runs right through the middle of this area. This border was defined in 1536, so it's a relatively recent feature. It partly follows the River Vyrnwy and the River Severn, but mainly follows much smaller streams and other features. For most of us, the main features in the landscape are the towns and villages where we live and work. Shrewsbury is the largest settlement on this map, home to more than 70,000 people. Other well-known Shropshire places include Oswestry, a small market town, Much Wenlock, a former monastic settlement, and Church Stretton, a popular tourist gateway to the picturesque Shropshire Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. Further east is the World Heritage Site at Ironbridge, now part of Telford, a new town created in the 1960s and home to over 150,000 people. On the other side of the border we have the market town of Welshpool, home for 6,000 people, and the more substantial settlement at Newtown, once a thriving centre of the textile industry, and Caersus and Llanidloes. All of these Welsh market towns serve extensive rural hinterlands. Montgomery is a small town today, but was once the capital of Montgomeryshire. And Llanymynech, where the border between Wales and England literally runs down the middle of the High Street, was a mining centre for over 3,000 years. Most of these settlements are on rivers. And if we take away the modern border, the significance of the rivers becomes much more obvious. And of course, before canals and railways in the 19th century, rivers were an important means of transporting goods. Indeed, if we take away all modern features completely, the rivers dominate the landscape. The other feature of this part of the world is the transition from high to low ground. The piece of ground on which Beacon Ring sits is called Long Mountain. It is very much on the edge of the upland to the west and southwest. Now, of course, Beacon Ring is not the only hill fort in this part of the world. There are in fact 130 hill forts shown on this map. Many of these are quite small, and some of them may not have been long-lived. Not all of these would have been built and used at the same time, of course. Even so, there is a lot going on here in late prehistory in the Iron Age. Most of these hill forts are focused along the river valleys, not just the main rivers, but also the smaller tributaries. These are natural routes for people and goods between high ground and low ground and across the landscape. Beacon Ring, for example, is one of several that overlook the upper Severn Valley, potentially controlling movement along it. It certainly dominates the landscape from its position on the edge of the long mountain, as we can see in this view looking up from near Powis Castle on the other side of the valley. This question of visibility, how well the hill fort could be seen, and what it could be seen from, and what could be seen from it, is important. Of course, not all of these 130 hill forts are visible from Beacon Ring. In fact, only about half of them, 69 in fact, can be seen, at least in theory. Of course, this still covers a lot of ground, and it seems to suggest that Beacon Ring might have been part of a network of hill forts that was focused on the confluence of the River Severn and the River Vyrnwy, and this is also the point where both rivers leave the high ground and flow out onto the fertile North Shropshire Plain. And here are some of the most impressive and prominent hill forts in the region. These include the Wrekin, a distinctive isolated summit over 30 kilometres to the east of Beacon Ring, with hilltop fortifications dating to the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Llanymynech, the largest hill fort in Wales at over 57 hectares, also with origins in the Bronze Age and an important mining centre since that time. The distinctive range of the Brython Hills, which include 5 hill forts or enclosures, including the main hill fort on the Brython itself, a significant and well-fortified Iron Age centre. And Earl's Hill, where, as well as the fort on the main hill itself, there are also 2 nearby, on Pontisford Hill and Callow Hill. The relationship between the hill forts themselves, as well as the rivers and other landscape features, is easily demonstrated by standing on top of one of them and looking around. For example, if we stand on the Wrekin and look west, we can see the River Severn meandering across the plain in front of us, with the high ground behind. And in this view, we can see Beacon Ring, prominent on the skyline of the looming bulk of Long Mountain. And we can also see all of these other prominent hill forts that we've just described. So, the relationship of the hill fort to its surroundings is very important, and these surroundings may include features that are some distance away. I will come back to questions and problems of visibility and landscape later, but now let's turn back to the hill fort itself, Beacon Ring. Perhaps the most important feature of any hill fort is the rampart or ramparts that surround it. The rampart is the bank and ditch. Some hill forts have many ramparts, but Beacon Ring has only one. The bank shows up well in this photograph as the white line below the trees. In places, the bank is over 8 metres high. It is perhaps at its most impressive here on the west side, where it faces the Severn Valley, looking down onto Welshpool. Here, and in other places too, the bank at Beacon Ring has a characteristic shelf about halfway up. This is an area of flatter ground where the steep slope of the outside of the bank is interrupted. This is an unusual feature on hill fort ramparts. The ditch here, and elsewhere around the hill fort, is quite boggy in places. Here on the north side, for example, the ditch has water in it most of the year round. This photograph was taken a few years ago at the start of a day's work with volunteers to clear the rampart of shrubs and other vegetation. Here is the same view at the end of the day. Conservation work like this protects the monument, partly from the roots of the vegetation itself, and also because the vegetation encourages burrowing animals, such as rabbits and badgers, which can seriously damage the earthwork. Having cleared the ramparts, we wanted to understand more about them. As always in archaeology, the first stage was surveying. This topographic survey was done by Chris Matthews. This has been coloured to show the angles of the slopes. Red is flatter and blue is steeper. The shelf around the outside shows up very clearly. We tried geophysical survey as well, but the geology meant that the results were not very helpful. So we also undertook an auger survey. Over 100 core samples were taken by drilling down into the earth. This identified the depth of the ditch, the extent of erosion of and from the ramparts, and the preservation of topsoil in the interior. From this work we identified 3 areas for archaeological excavation. There was a gap in the bank on the northwestern side, and we wanted to see if this was an original entrance feature or something that had been created later. We also wanted a section across the rampart to learn how it had been built. We chose a spot where the top of the rampart had already been damaged. The gap in the bank on the southern side of the hill fort looked convincingly original, but still needed investigation. The banks on either side weren't quite aligned, and the entrance was unusually wide. So let's start with the north gateway. Here is a view of the northwestern corner of the hill fort looking southwest. This is the bank, and this is the ditch. There is a gap in the bank here, and the Auger survey suggested that the ditch seemed to disappear at this point. So we excavated 2 trenches to try and work out what was going on with the bank and the ditch. The ditch clearly ended about 10 metres west of the gap in the bank. The bank, however, told a different story. Here it was clear that the bank had originally been built as a continuous feature. The gap was a later modification, introducing an entranceway where before there was none. The original stone core of the bank had been spread out and crushed, effectively making a firm access path through the ramparts. Of course, this still didn't explain the original gap in the ditch, but more of that in a moment. Moving now to the east side of the hill fort and our excavation of the rampart structure. We excavated the whole earthwork by hand in the hot summer of 2018. This view shows the rampart looking north with the first layer of topsoil removed. And here we are 3 weeks later with a nice section through the rampart. We were disappointed not to find large structural timbers or masonry walls, but there's a lot going on here nevertheless. First, the top of the bank is much more stony than the base of it. Second, the bank is built directly on top of the original ground surface, and this buried topsoil was preserved as a distinct layer. Third, the shelf, which we have seen elsewhere, is visible here, but apparently filled in. Hopefully you can still pick these things out. The infilled shelf is perhaps clearer in the cross-section view. Above the line, the shelf has been filled in, either deliberately or through erosion. And all of these things are also visible in this overhead view. The buried soil horizon, the original topsoil that was here before the hill fort was built, shows up very clearly in this photograph as a dark humic soil. As archaeologists, we very carefully record all of these relationships so that we can work out how the ramparts were built. On this part of the long mountain, there is a layer of clay on top of a layer of easily fragmented sedimentary shale. The hill fort builders first excavated the ditch, digging through the clay to the shale underneath. The material that they dug out to make this ditch was then dumped inside the ditch to make the bank. And this explains why the bank has a stony cap, because effectively it is a mirror image of the material in the ditch from which it was created. After the ramparts were built, then some of the irregularities would have been filled in. Later, material from the top of the bank would have washed down and into the ditch. At this point, the shelf was filled in, but the evidence from elsewhere on Beacon Ring suggests that this process was not fully completed. Gradually, over hundreds of years, the modern topsoil formed. And, as we have seen, this whole process buried the original topsoil underneath the bank of the hill fort. If we could find out the date of this soil, we could learn when the hill fort was built. We did try radiocarbon dating this layer, but the results were not precise, because the soil had been there for many thousands of years before the hill fort was built. So we asked for help from some colleagues in Scotland. Here are David Sanderson and Alan Creswell from SUEC at Beacon Ring with their portable optical spectrum luminescence machine. In simple terms, optical spectrum luminescence, or OSL, is a dating method that measures doses of ionizing radiation, that is, X-rays or gamma rays, that have been received by sedimentary materials, specifically electrons in the crystalline structure of quartz grains. In other words, when a layer of soil is exposed to sunlight, the electrons are energized, known as a state of excitation. When that soil is sealed, a phase known as storage, the agitation stops. When exposed again to what is known as stimulation light, the signature of the luminescence emitted reveals how long it has been in storage. Therefore, with careful sampling and analysis, both in the field and the laboratory, it's possible to tell when a buried soil horizon was last exposed to sunlight, and thus to date the feature that was built over the top of it. For OSL dating to work, the sedimentary context needs to be understood. So as well as the buried soil horizon itself, samples were taken from above and below. You can see the sequence here. The field measurements showed that the buried soil horizon produced a different luminescence signature from the surrounding layers. This was confirmed by laboratory testing, which suggested that this soil was buried roughly between 400 and 300 BCE, so we can say that the rampart was probably built in the late Iron Age. Finally, we turned our attention to the gateway or entrance at the southern end of the site. Here is an aerial view looking north, taken by our CPAT colleague Mark Walters. The bank is very clear, curving round, but as I said earlier, the two sides aren't in perfect alignment. The ditch is very substantial, especially on the western side. You can also see here from the size of the people in the photograph just how wide this entrance is. It is over 20 metres between the two ramparts. One suggestion was that this gap had been filled by a timber gatehouse structure, perhaps a bit like this reconstructed example at Biskupen in Poland. Such a structure would have needed substantial posts set deep into the ground. However, the geophysical survey, and indeed our excavations, found no evidence for any posts here at all. In 2019, we excavated a large area on the western side of the entrance. This is a view from above. Again, you can see the end of the bank, clearly deliberately shaped rather than cut through, and alongside it, the ditch. Also, at the bottom of the photograph, you can see some faint lines in the soil. These are part of a trackway that was recorded in the 19th century and not an earlier feature. The rectangle there is our evaluation trench from 2018. We can also see a pile of stones, here on the edge of the ditch at the base of the bank. We'll come back to that in a minute. First, let's look at the bank. We dug a small trench through it, and, perhaps not surprisingly, found that it had been built in much the same way as the other bank. A stony base and a clay body with a stony cap. There was also a buried soil horizon here, and a clue to the origin of the shelf. On top of the original soil horizon was a layer of compacted clay and soil. This is easily recognisable to archaeologists as the kind of layer that's created by muddy boots trampling around whilst moving earth. So perhaps the shelf is a remnant of the level to where the material excavated from the ditch was thrown before being shovelled up again to create the bank. Finally, let's look again at that pile of stones. It's just that, a pile. There is no structural integrity, nor an obvious reason for creating a platform here. It was the subject of a lot of thought by the whole team. Of course, on its own, it makes no sense, but archaeology is all about bringing together many different strands of evidence. There was the shelf, created as part of the construction process, which was never properly filled in after the rampart was built. Then, there was the incomplete ditch on the northeastern side of the hillfort. Next, the very wide and badly aligned south entrance, and no evidence of anything being built here. So we concluded that the hillfort was never actually finished, and that this load of stones was thrown up from the ditch, intended to be used in the rampart, but for some reason construction stopped. So what have we learnt about Beacon Ring as an Iron Age hillfort? Well, firstly, and most importantly, we have a date for the construction of the rampart. We know it was built between 400 and 300 BCE. As far as I know, this is the first time a rampart has been dated using OSL. Secondly, we know it was never finished. Of course, what we don't know, and may never know, is why. Why was it built in the first place, and why was it abandoned when it was so nearly complete? To help understand that, we can come back to thinking about the landscape context. As we have seen, Beacon Ring is just one of many hillforts in this area, forming part of a particular group that is focused on the upper Severn Valley and on the confluence between the Severn and the Vyrnwy. Let's have a closer look. Earl's Hill is some way to the east, but very clearly intervisible with Beacon Ring. It also connects with the Wrekin, and so the three hillforts together control over 60 kilometres of the River Severn. This view, looking east from Beacon Ring, clearly shows these relationships. On the right-hand side of this photograph is Eastridge Hill, which leads south to the Stiperstones. The rocky ridge of the Stiperstones was a rich source of lead and other minerals. Castle Ring sits at the north end of that ridge. and the Long Mountain looms large in the view from the Stiper Stones. Beacon Ring is a prominent feature on the skyline at the highest point of the Long Mountain. The next high ground to the south of the Long Mountain is the Kerry Ridgeway, and between the two is the fertile Vale of Montgomery. This is dominated by the hill fort at Freethfoldwin. Excavations at Freethfoldwin in the 1930s suggested a long and complex history, with some Neolithic occupation before an enclosure was built in the Bronze Age. This was later added to in the Iron Age, with several ramparts and later much more complex entrance earthworks. Another very important complex hill fort lies to the west, behind the Severn Valley but prominent in the landscape. This is Gervar, which is covered in woodland and has never been excavated. Colleagues from the Welsh Royal Commission did a survey here in 2007, which showed just how complex and extensive the earthworks are, but there is no evidence for the date of this hill fort. The same can be said of its near neighbour, Crowther's Camp, which sits on the western side of the Severn Valley. Although the hill fort itself has not been excavated, it's famous for the nearby discovery in 1862 of the Gillsfield Hoard. This contained 120 pieces of metalwork, including pole staves, socketed axes, swords and spearheads. The artefacts themselves dated from the late Bronze Age and were perhaps buried around 700 BCE. Another Bronze Age site, which as we've already seen is the largest hill fort in Wales, can be found to the north at Llanamunnock. The craggy hill itself provides a natural defence which is enhanced in the Iron Age with a rampart. Again, this site was valuable for its minerals, in this case copper, with mining and metallurgy going on here into the Roman period. Last, but by no means least, we come to the cluster of hill forts and associated settlements on the group of hills collectively known as the Brython. These include the Brython itself, as well as the smaller hill fort at Cefn y Castell on Middletown Hill. The Brython was famously excavated by Chris Musson and colleagues in the 1970s, revealing a long sequence of occupation from the late Bronze Age through to the 4th century CE. The peak of its existence appears to be in the late Iron Age, when the space inside the revetted triple ramparts was occupied by a sequence of substantial settlements, the roundhouses and storage buildings of some of which we see here. The Brython hill forts are a very expansive and indeed commanding vista. This is the view looking north. Llanamunnock is in the middle distance, and we can see both the Severn and the Vyrnwy meandering across the plain towards each other. Turning the other way, there is a long range view upstream along the valley of the River Severn, and of course there is clearly also a strong visual relationship with Beacon Ring. Finally, although I suspect the point has already been made, a short tramp through the forest and bracken takes us across to Cefn y Castell on the summit of Middletown Hill. The view here commands the pass between the Brython Range and the Long Mountain, but we also get a glimpse of the River Severn, and there on the horizon is of course Beacon Ring. So what does this all mean? On one hand, it's self-evident that you can see the tops of hills from the tops of other hills. Therefore, the intervisibility of hill forts is perhaps not surprising. But the relationship between these sites and with their own hinterlands, as well as the wider territory, must have had significance. Of course, this one was never finished, so its role in the scheme of things is not clear. But the date of its construction is interesting, just at a time when pressures on resources were increasing and perhaps the stability of the Iron Age social order was being threatened by climate change and by political instability. Whether it was finished or not, or whether it acted as a fort or not, the construction of a hill fort sent a clear signal that someone could control significant resources. To take a large body of labour away from essential agriculture and industry and trade to construct a statement of power is itself a statement of power. So much for space. Now back to time for the last part of the talk. So what happened to Beacon Ring after the Iron Age? Well, the Romans appear to have had very little impact. Of course, they set fire to the Wrekin and built their new city on the banks of the River Severn at Wroxeter. There was a significant Roman military presence further upriver at Caersus, and of course a substantial road network linking everything together, including a significant and well-defended crossing place at Ford and Gaer, in the shadow of the Long Mountain. and we already talked about Roman mining and metalworking at Llanymynech. So turning to the time after the Romans, the early medieval period was one of turbulence, with political and military rivalries often coming to a head in this border landscape. Beacon Ring in fact played a central part in some heroic struggles. In the 7th century, Northumbria was the dominant kingdom in what is now England, with Gwynedd on the ascendancy in Wales. One of the earliest references to Beacon Ring comes from a later poetic saga describing these 7th century battles. Famously, Cadwallon ap Cadfan, who was king of Gwynedd in the 620s and 630s, defeated and killed King Edwin of Northumbria. According to the Welsh poets, part of this struggle took place in this landscape. Cadwallon used Beacon Ring as his camp, where he stayed for 7 months, carrying out 7 skirmishes every day. Cadwallon did not hold Northumbria for long, and in time that kingdom lost its dominance. For the next 300 years, what is now England was dominated by Mercia. Meanwhile, the princes of Powys had become preeminent in Wales. Perhaps the most famous king of Mercia was King Offa, who ruled in the 8th century. A European statesman and diplomat, Offa is best known for the linear earthwork that marked the western boundary of his kingdom. Offa's dyke made use of a number of hill forts, including Llanymynech, where it is anchored into the Iron Age ramparts. Wat's dyke, a parallel and broadly contemporary linear earthwork, is similarly connected to the ramparts of Old Oswestry hill fort. Offa's dyke also passes close to Beacon Ring, perhaps not close enough for the hill fort to have been a significant factor in the dyke's location, but the same considerations applied. Offa's dyke is all about seeing and being seen in the landscape, and, as we have seen, the Long Mountain offers a commanding vista of the upper Severn Valley. After Offa's death, Mercia declined and Wessex dominated. All of this came to an end with the Norman conquest in the 11th century. One of the defining characteristics of Norman rule was the measurement and reallocation of land. Many modern administrative boundaries in this part of the world date from this time. One interesting feature of Beacon Ring is that it is bisected by a small linear earthwork. This is shown on early mapping. It is in fact the parish boundary between Leighton and Trellaston townships. Probably laid out in the early 12th century or perhaps before, the hill fort was used as an obvious landmark and perhaps a piece of neutral ground. The bank is clearly visible as it passes through the south entrance of the hill fort and can be traced through the whole site. It passes down the hill, marked by the hedgerow that you can see in this photograph. We excavated a small trench here in 2018. Unfortunately, other than showing that it was later than the hill fort, we learn no more about this feature. The trench, however, proved a popular stopping point for walkers on the Offa's Dyke Trail, which passes through Beacon Ring. I spoke earlier about Cadwallon, who was the last British king to hold land in eastern Britain until the rise of the House of Tudor nearly 900 years later. Naturally, Beacon Ring features in this story as well, in which Henry Tudor overthrew the Plantagenet king Richard III and set up a new dynasty. Henry marched an army up through Wales via Cardigan and Machynlleth. Meanwhile, Rhys ap Thomas marched a body of men up from Brecon. The two armies came together at Beacon Ring, before moving to Shrewsbury and then on to engage with Richard III at Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard III was killed and his body was dumped in a car park in Leicester, where archaeologists found it a few years ago. Richard's reign has been overshadowed by later events, but he was responsible for one important innovation in communications. This was setting up a system of beacons. Now, we normally associate beacons with the Spanish Armada in the 16th century, but this early warning system, a series of fires and braziers mounted on poles on the tops of hills, was established long before that. Naturally, communication over the longest distance required a prominent hill, for the same reasons that hill forts were built in the first place. So this is how Beacon Ring got its name. This 1660s estate map shows the Beacon Place, with the green circle representing the rampart of the hill fort, and the dotted line marking the old parish boundary. This is thought to be the oldest depiction of a hill fort in Wales. You've got used to seeing this image too. And again, it's not surprising that the modern telecommunications mast is also located here. Like the beacon, This is part of a 2,500-year-long tradition of being visible, being in touch, and communicating with fellow humans. There's more. So, we have talked about visibility and communication and survey. This all comes together in the 19th century. Most of us in the United Kingdom are familiar with Ordnance Survey mapping. This is an example of the second edition Ordnance Survey map from the 1880s. The triangular symbol at the middle of the map represents a surveying station. The Ordnance Survey was originally part of the War Office and began making military maps in the 18th century. Between 1783 and 1853 it undertook the principal triangulation of Britain and Ireland, setting up survey stations on high points all over the place. In those days, all the levels were taken in relation to sea level at Liverpool. Later, the datum was changed to the sea level at Newlyn, and the re-triangulation of Great Britain followed in the 1930s and 1940s. This was when we saw the creation of the iconic triangulation pillar, more commonly known as trig points. These were set up all over these islands, and although now superseded by GPS, remain as testament to those pioneers of early mapping. Here we see the trig point at Beacon Ring, just behind the trench we excavated in 2020. The Beacon Ring trig point was installed in 1948. Our trench also found the remains of an earlier trig point and benchmark. These had probably been laid out as part of the principal triangulation in the 19th century. The older benchmark was in two parts. The lower part was a stone slab with a Board of Ordnance broad arrow symbol carved into it. The second part was a later concrete block, perhaps installed to reflect the change from the Liverpool to Newlyn datum between 1912 and 1921. Finally, it's difficult to talk about Beacon Ring without discussing the trees. The trig point was quickly made obsolete by the plantation that's on the site today. In fact, this is the second plantation that was made on Beacon Ring. The first trees were planted in the 19th century and were felled by 1910. We actually found evidence for the former tree roots in some of our excavation trenches in the woods. The present plantation is well known locally as it features the monogram E2R. This is because it was planted in 1953, the year of the Queen's coronation. However, the plantation does not actually commemorate that event. The memorial stone, which survives on site, tells us that these trees were planted by Helen Solveig Ackers in December 1953. Helen Solveig Ackers was the daughter of Charles Ackers by his second wife. Charles Ackers was a forestry man and worked for the local Leighton estate in the 1930s, where he wrote a well-received forestry textbook. He had a son from his first marriage who was a pilot in the Second World War and, sadly, was killed. After that, Charles Ackers remarried and worked on creating plantations with designs that could only be seen from the air. Perhaps the Beacon Ring plantation was a message to his lost son. I said at the beginning that Beacon Ring was not unique because it's one of many thousands of hill forts throughout Europe. However, every hill fort is different, and of course the story of Beacon Ring through the ages is indeed unique, as I hope I've shown today. But we do need to do more. There are two main areas for future research: time and space. First, the dating work we have done on the Rampart here is unique, but the chronology of hill fort construction and occupation is still very little understood. I've talked today about the possible relationships between Beacon Ring and its neighbours, but until we can establish which hill forts were built when, then a lot of this is very speculative. So I would like to see a more comprehensive effort to look at the dates of these structures. Second, we need to understand much more about the landscapes around these hill forts, how they were used and perceived. We will be doing more work at Beacon Ring, with events and open days when we're able to do so. We're also going to be publishing a book about the site and its surrounding landscape later this year, so please keep an eye on our website for announcements and opportunities. Finally, I must thank everyone who made this possible. Funding for a lot of the project work and scheduled monument consent came from our colleagues at CADU. Thanks also to the team at SUAC and colleagues at Saxion University and Deventer, and to ASW, and of course all the staff and volunteers who have helped along the way. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please do ask them after the live broadcast. Thank you very much.